Shadows are an integral part of photographic lighting. I once heard a quote, and it stuck with me for many, many years. A good photographer understands about light. A great photographer understands about shadows. Many photographers I speak to are unsure or afraid about shadows in their images. If we have light, we have shadows. They go together. Don't be afraid of using shadows in your images. Shadows are a big part of understanding lighting in photography. Another great quote I've heard is, to create a great image, don't light everything. Which means leave some shadows in your image. Leave some dark areas to contrast with those light areas. Shadows can create some amazing things in your images if you just use them properly. Now, a shadow is defined as something dark in your image, something darker than the highlights in your image. It can be a dark space in your image. It can be an actual shadow thrown by your subject or from something outside the image. But it creates some contrast with the light in your image to attract the eye to particular parts of your photograph. If light is a tool that we use as photographers, then shadow is the art that we create with it. So embrace the dark side and see your photography grow. Shadows enable us to show shape and form in our images. Look at these images. The highlight areas are the areas that your eye goes to, so that I can determine where your eye moves around that image. The shadow parts emphasize those highlights. It shows us the shape, it shows us the contours in that face or in that image. Shadows can also show texture. Particularly if you have the light coming across your subject or across a part of your image, you can show that texture using those highlights and shadows right next to each other. There's a number of different ways we can use texture in our images, but we need shadows there to do it. Depth. Shadows can create depth in an image. It can give you a perception of a 3D subject, even though your image is just 2D. With backlight, with sidelight, with a range of different options, we can use those shadows to create depth in our image. Mood. We can change the mood of our image, or we can determine the mood of our image by using high key, warm, comfortable, brighter images with less shadow. Or we can use low key for dramatic, unsettling, even scary images, because we're using more of the dark side of our lighting rather than the bright side. Contrast. The contrast that we get from deep shadows and bright highlights can make your images pop. It can make your images stand out. It can stop people scrolling. You can make those high contrast images quite easily, but you need to understand how to use those shadows in your image. Shadows can simplify an image by breaking it down to the important parts, hiding a lot of the details that just don't need to be there to tell the story. So you can throw them into darkness or throw them into shadow. Tension. You can create tension with shadows as well. The difference between those highlights and the shadows, the depth of the shadows, the way the shadows work in your image can create tension in an image. Or mystery. You can create mystery in your images by hiding certain parts of your image. So the viewer has to think about what's in there. Why is that hidden? What would happen if I could see part of that image that's in shadow? Framing. Obviously, framing, you can use those highlights and shadows to frame your image, to direct the viewer's eye to the important parts of your image that you want them to look at, and using those shadows to direct the eye to that particular part of your photograph. And emotions. As I've said before, the emotion of an image, the darkness, the bleakness, the brightness, the happiness, all of those things will depend on the shadows, the depth of the shadows, the amount of shadows, how long the shadows are. Now I want to stop for a moment and thank you people for the encouragement and the positive comments that you've been leaving on my videos. I know a lot of you, the majority of you, watch these videos on your TV, which makes it difficult to subscribe or like any of these videos, but that's really going to help me if you can possibly do that. So if you do watch me on television and you are a fan of the channel, please take the time to open up your phone and subscribe on your phone or on your computer. Subscribe, like, comment, whatever you can, because that's going to help my channel to grow and it's going to help me to serve you in the way that I have been over the past few months. Thanks for that. We can control the shadows in our image in a number of different ways. We can control the quality of the light, the direction, the intensity and the color, which are the 4 characteristics of light that I always go on about. These are the important things that you need to know about lighting and shadows in your image. We can change the hardness or the softness of those shadows, the transition between bright and dark, by changing the size of our light source. We all know that hard light comes from a small light source. So a small light source or hard light will give you very distinct shadows, a very fine line between that highlight and the shadow. The transition is fairly fast between that shadow and the highlight area. So that gives us a little bit more of a tension in that image. Whereas if we used softer light, a larger light source, the transition from that highlight to shadow is more gradual. It's a bit of a softer feel to the image. It creates a whole different mood from the hard light or the very sharp transition in that shadow. We can control the direction of those shadows simply by controlling the direction of the light. We can place our light to the side to create long shadows, as we might get in the late afternoon sun or the early morning sun. This is why photographers love shooting at those times of day, using that sunlight, because it creates long shadows that we can use to emphasize the texture, the shape, the contours of our image. Whether we're shooting landscapes, people, still life, whatever, we can control the direction of that light. A frontal light will create very few shadows because that light's coming from pretty close to the camera axis. So there's no chance for those shadows to show up in your image. That's a technique we often use in glamour photography or portrait photography, particularly with female subjects, because we don't want that texture in the skin. We don't want to show those shadows from the facial features. We want to flatten those features as much as we can to make our subject look as attractive as possible. So that front light is the way that we do it. Less shadows, more attractive subject. That's a generalization. The intensity of the light. If we have a bright light with very dark shadows, it gives us a more contrasty, more impactful sort of image. If we have a little bit more fill in those shadows, a little bit more detail in those shadows, it gives the viewer a little bit more to explore and opens up those shadows a little bit more to whatever's in there. Whatever textures or whatever details are in those shadows, we can show them. We can decide to intensify those shadows to make things darker, or we can lighten those shadows with a bit of fill light or controlling our lighting so that we get a little bit more detail in those shadow areas. And the color of the shadows. We can dictate the color of those shadows by using colored light in our original image, or we can use extra lighting in our image to color those shadows. It gives us a whole range of different opportunities that we can do with color in our images. Here I've used backlit flash with gels on the lights, just speed lights, to control the light in the hair, to control the light in the shadows, because it's no use putting extra lights in our image if we don't have shadows in there, because secondary lighting will only work in the shadow areas. We need to create shadows with our main light in the first place, and then we throw that colored light into those shadow areas. So here are some examples of using shadows in your images. We can use shadowless light, as I mentioned before, light that comes pretty much straight from the camera axis. It creates less shadow, it creates very fine shadows so that that subject appears very softly lit from the front, very flattering sort of light to use. We can light our shadows, we can put some extra light into those shadows, as we have here, just to show a bit more detail into those shadows. We can have deep, dark shadows to create more drama in the image, as we do with these images. Now, when we're creating these hard light sources to give us distinct shadows, we need a small light source. And the obvious small light source we can use is the sun, because it's very small in relation to us, so it gives us very sharp shadows. The other way we can do it is with your speed light. Your simple flash that you pop on top of your camera, you can use that off camera to create a hard light source, and that allows you to get these very sharp, distinct shadows. Constant light can be a great opportunity for photographers when controlling those shadows, because what we see is what we get with constant light. With flash, we need to position our lighting, we need to take a shot, check our LCD screen, and then modify it to suit our purposes. But with constant light, we can see those shadows, we can see those highlights, we can see where they're falling. So it gives us more of an opportunity to work with those shadows and to work with the sculpting and the shape in our image. Creating pockets of light in your image. So some parts are in shadow, some parts are in highlight. You can do this with light painting, obviously with a torch, so that you can just light those areas that you want lit. You can also do it with gobos so that you can darken some parts of your image and allow the light to come through the gobo to light particular sections that you want shown. There's a range of different options we can do when we use gobos in our photography. We can use different shapes, different colors. We can do all sorts of things using gobos. And the advantage of those gobos is that it creates a shadow area that contrasts with the highlight area. We do need to be careful when we're using multiple lights that we don't get crossed shadows, because your brain expects there to be one light source in every image that we look at, because in nature we only have one light source, which is the sun. So as soon as we have two shadows showing in the image from different directions, your brain straight away says that's artificial, I'm not sure about that, it looks a little bit contrived. So be careful that if you use two or more light sources in your image, that you don't get those crossed shadows and that the image looks like it's been taken with one light source. One thing that's become popular over the last couple of years is the optical spots. So we can use the optical spot on our flash or on our light source to create patterns of shadows in our image. Those patterns of shadows are unusual. They look a bit different. That's why photographers love those optical spots, because the shadows look a little bit different. They make your image look a bit unusual. Whether you're using it indoors or outdoors, it can create a little bit of puzzling light in your image to intrigue the viewer a little bit more. And it's all because of those shadow areas. We can also use shadows as our main subject. We can use the shadow that's cast from our subject and just shoot that to tell the story of our image. Look at all of these images. The shadow's been used as the main subject itself. And that creates an intrigue in the image as well. We allow the viewer to imagine what is outside of the frame, what's happening outside the frame, because we can see that shadow cast by the light from our subject that isn't even in the picture. We can also use those shadows as a component of our image, photographing our subject within the frame and using their shadow as a little extra piece in there, a little bit more information. You can see these shadows, because of the lighting angle, it shows the shape, it shows the profile of my subject. We can also use exterior things like trees, shrubs, hand railings, those sort of things to throw shadows onto our subject. This is a similar sort of thing to using a gobo, but it's a more of a natural thing, it's a natural feel. Here we've used the trees to throw those shadows onto a background, and our subject has been manipulated to be in the right place at the right time for that particular image. We can see that the model is placed in a part of the image where it works, with those shadows around the outside of her. Again, it creates a very intriguing image, and it creates something a little bit different that you normally would not see. But taking advantage of those shadows in the image creates a great shot. Here are a few other images using these principles, using shadows as an integral part of the image. So try it yourself. Use shadows in your image. Take notice of the shadows. When you're lighting your subject, whether you're shooting outdoors, natural light, in sunlight, or indoors using flash or strobe or constant light, take note of those shadows. Think about how important those shadows can be. Think about how it shows the shape, the mood, the contrast, the composition of your image. All of those things will benefit if you take notice of the shadows in your image. I'll see you next time.